Thank you for joining us for MASSP's Leader to Leader today. We are pleased to bring together a panel of experts around the work of the roadmap for returning to school. Before we get started, we would encourage you to introduce yourself within the chat function. Please mention who you are, where you're from, and what your role is, and maybe one hope or question you have for today's session. Please know that we are recording this and we will post it for those to access. And we will distribute also in our next headlines a copy of or a link to the recording, as well as copies of the handouts and slide decks that we used during today's session. With that said, we will also be using the Q&A system to pose questions and upvote questions you may want to have addressed. So if you have questions as our panel is speaking and presenting, please do take some time to add those to the Q&A feature. If you have ideas or comments that you'd like to add, feel free to add that to the chat. So question and answers for those that you want addressed by the panel, the chat function to be able to introduce yourself and add ideas and comments to the work. With that, at this time, I'd like to introduce with us today is John Krause. He's the Director of Instructional Services with Muskegon Area ISD. He is the former principal at the Kent Career Tech Center and Sparta High School. With us also is Tom Livesey, the superintendent of Oak Ridge Schools, who was instrumental in putting together some of the initial questionnaires and prepared plans, and high school principal Jason McBoy, and MASSP board member from Oak Ridge High School. So thank you for joining us today. Ryan Casey is manning the technology and making sure that everything works seamlessly as we go through today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. We're going to go in this order. And John, you're going to kick us off. So tell us a little bit about your role as a co-chair of the GELN Continuity Learning Task Force, what that means, and what your focus was.
Great. Thanks, Colin. Really appreciate the opportunity to work with MASSP and hopefully provide some positive contributions to your members. So, yeah, I have been a principal really all my educational life. You know, you mentioned some of the places I was. I was actually the teacher at Sparta High School and a principal at Comstock Park High School. And then most recently, the principal at Kent Career Tech Center, and now serving as the general education director of instructional services for Muskegon Area ISD. And with that, I'm not sure how prevalent it's known among principals, because I didn't know a lot about GELN, but the GELN is the General Education Leadership Network that is a network of ISD curriculum directors that meets monthly and engages in various task force work like the literacy essentials, the disciplinary literacy essentials, math essentials. They've done a lot of work with College Board. And when the pandemic happened and the first executive order was put out by the governor, it was named that MAISA, which is the parent organization of GELN, would write the template that was required for continuity of learning plans. And so we very quickly formed a work group, a lot of the directors around the state and myself, and were able to put out the initial early guidance documents that came out in April that helped districts complete those plans. From that, we knew that there was an urgency, seeing that this was going to go longer term than just this year, to make that into more of a task force. And I volunteered. I'm a co-chair on that. So Dave Krebs is the leader or the executive director. Doug Greer is a co-chair out of Ottawa ISD, and Mike Yoakum from Oakland Schools is one of the co-chairs. So the three of us have been working with about 26 or 27 different individuals, some GELN members, and some like Tom Livesey and other special education leaders, as well as, we had Tracy Wilson representing the principal's voice on there to try to come together to prepare these guidance documents throughout the summer.
You talked to us a little bit about the process that you've kind of helped to spearhead with Tom and crew around this 10-step plan for writing your plan, and how it kind of folds all the different resources you talked about together.
Yeah, one of the things I think that became very evident was, everybody was being saturated with so much information and so many different well-intended guidance documents, whether it be coming from other states, whether it be coming from other regions, things that were being developed, within a local district. And how could you focus on what do I pay attention to, or what can organize or aggregate this? And so the task force, when we formed, really said, let's make sure that we're regionally representing the entire state, as well as, not just relying on our own members, but reaching out to practicing superintendents like Tom, principals, special education persons in those roles, to help find the very best guidance and then put it into an organized format. But even that still became overwhelming. And one of the things that we were able to do, as you're aware, Colin, was the collaboration between MASSP and MAISA, GELN, MASA, Michigan Virtual. We've been meeting, if not weekly, every other week, to really try to align the work that we are putting out. And I think it's one of the most positive collaborative efforts I've seen between associations, since I've been in education, and it's produced, I think, meaningful work that is helping our districts. That's our intent. It's to serve. And from that, it led to that 10-step process, and I can share my screen here, that somehow has seemed to make its way around the state. And so this was not a work product necessarily of GELN, but it was really out of the conversations with those collaborative organizations saying, how can we help not only share the guidance, but teach people how to use the guidance? And so as an ISD, we also are writing a preparedness plan. In fact, we've been doing that for the better part of 2 weeks. And we just decided to document the approach that we wanted to take with our return to school committee. And we're making good progress, but we've learned some things along the way. And I know, Tom is following a similar process, and they've learned some things along the way. The one thing that's guaranteed is change, right? I mean, we got new guidance from the CDC just last week. We're getting new information from our health departments. And so you just have to be a little, adaptable to the change that's happening. There's a video that supports this, a 5-minute YouTube video that really walks people through. We think that at this point, most districts are well engaged and hopefully are using this or a version of this to write their plans. One of the things, Colin, that you contributed, your organization, was this incredible tracking device that allowed us, very systematically to approach our plan writing as an ISD and make sure that we were checking every box and had language that corresponded to all of the required and strongly recommended components. So we used, we had the executive order, because that's a lighter version of what really is required, but we also have a full plan that we're writing. And we started with the executive order. We're moving in now to writing our full plan. Includes instruction, includes emotional wellness and mental health components, and the technology components. And we've looked at other guidance too, that again is coming out, from the region. Kent ISD has provided some things I think you've shared on your website around some things that were developed with Spectrum Health and vetted by Troon around some of the safety protocols and the screening protocols. And then we put a process together of how are we going to organize this work and do it virtually, because we are still, as you can see, I'm in my home. Most of our staff are in their home, and we needed a way to divide and conquer. And I think this allowed us to do it. And we'll share this link, in the chat and also in the follow-up email that will come out. So what it's resulting in then is we built our plan off of the GELN template. And actually this template came from Tom's district. And so they had a jump start on how they were organizing. GELN liked what Tom was doing and how he was working with his district. And so we now have, come to, almost completion of this. One thing that I want to call out, because it was new language that was introduced yesterday at GELN, and it was very important to the special education community, and we were in full agreement of this, was around some of the language of how would students who are not wearing masks be managed. And so it was certainly not just, hey, we're going to remove them from school. We want to use PBIS in making sure that we're teaching the routines, being clear with our expectations, and practicing those, not just with masks, but with any of the new expectations that we're having. So we just don't jump to immediate removal. So I really wanted to call this out.
Just before you go much further, one thing that was clarified in a recent FAQ that the governor's office put out is that when they refer to masks, they're talking about those cotton two-sided, like the handmade masks that are there. Shields do not count as masks and are not permitted as a substitute for wearing a mask by students, including those students who need to wear those masks all day long in the 6th through 12th grades.
Thank you. There's been a lot of confusion around what constitutes a face covering or a mask and how that language is used. And so in many cases, and I think Tom and Jason will echo this, we just took language right from the roadmap and placed it in to say this is what we will do. And we also then crafted, some of our own language from the sample language that was in the plans. Where we spent some time today now is in what is our timeline? We have a board meeting on the 13th where the executive order, the shorter version, we will plan to have adopted, but we're going to be sending this out hopefully Monday to our entire staff, those especially that are involved in the instructional programs to have a look at, offer feedback. Again, there's a lot of tensions right now between associations and administration around what these plans are looking like. So I don't know that we'll be able to accommodate every request, but at least we're informing our internal community, and then we will have a plan to start sending out building specific letters to families, hopefully if not next week, the week after that. So that's kind of the process that MAISD has engaged in writing the plan, and we're going to share this with our local districts that we serve, because they had requested that if there's language that works for us and they like that language and then our health department has approved it, it makes it a much more efficient process than having the health department have to approve maybe 12 or 15 different plans.
Knowing, John, that you once were a building principal at a local district as well as a principal at a career tech center at King ISD, what are some things that, knowing what you know from being a building principal in those two settings, as well as being a co-chair of this task force and being involved in the extensive research, what would be your takeaway, or what would you recommend principals be doing now and next as they move forward with their plans?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Colin. I'm going to answer this as John Krause, not as GELN and not as MAISD. But having this window into all of these meetings and experiences and looking at all the different models and hearing, what is capable and isn't capable, in various regions for various reasons. Also drawing on my, my experience as a principal, I would double down on getting every teacher built to be a teacher of remote learning in a quality way. And I don't think you can do that overnight. I think, you have to have a realistic plan to do it. But whether it's a pandemic or whether it's a snow day or whether it's just 2 kids that are out ill, we need to be more progressive in how we're leveraging technology and education. We think of school, as the education. School is a building, it's a facility. Education is a service. And we need to be thinking about the planned experience for kids as a service. And when you look at other services, that we consume, we used to go to banks. Banks were buildings. Now banking is a service, right? We used to go to restaurants. We can't do that right now. But food delivery, meal prep is a service. Retail. So how can we help move the mindset of our teachers that whether the education is happening in the building, it affords a lot of opportunities because of equipment and labs and those, those collaborative, opportunities, but education can be delivered virtually. So that's number one is trying to build that capacity for teachers. Number 2 is I would really try to focus, how do I separate my teachers' responsibilities from management responsibilities? And by that, I mean, teachers have a very, very specific and unique skill set. I'd liken it to an airline pilot, right? I want the pilot to fly the plane. I don't need him to, to maintenance the engine. I don't need him to, or her, to serve the passengers, drinks or food on the plane. Lock them away, and they can still be effective. They can communicate to the passengers for things that they need. How can we bring in then, safety personnel who are, trained, or this is what I signed up for, to help manage the students, at least during this current time in the pandemic, to keep them safe. It might mean spreading kids out all over the building, gymnasiums, auditoriums, to create that distance. And maybe in that you can bring more less certified people, but more people who are reflective of your community into your school to help supervise. We know that there's a lot of students who don't see adults in leadership roles that look like them in their buildings, and maybe this is a way to diversify staff. I know that takes funding. I would be leveraging hard on MASSP and other organizations to say, we need those care dollars, or we need those dollars to be able to add staff to make our buildings safe and let our teachers focus on teaching. And then the last piece is I would look at a standardized curriculum. I know you had the Michigan Virtual Leader2Leader yesterday. I would take that off the plates of teachers. I look at it this way: Michigan Virtual, that's the studs in the drywall of construction. It's not very different than the textbooks. And what the teachers can then bring, if they don't have to plan for that, is the paint, the floor coverings, how they're going to furnish that, the personalization, building that relationship, focusing on the facilitation of learning rather than focusing on building all of these lessons. You can then create, I think, better equity in terms of the content that students are engaging in. And if that teacher is no longer available to teach those students, there's still a continuity of learning for whoever comes in next, that the curriculum is there. And so, those are the things that I would be thinking about right now. We have to be able to understand it's going to be a disappointing year. It already was last year. I have a nephew who didn't graduate, in Wisconsin. I have a stepdaughter who got her doctor's degree in pharmacy, didn't get to graduate for Ferris State. Those are really disappointing, and unfortunately we have to be real with the times that we're in and understand we will get back to those things, but I just don't know that you can prioritize some of the things that consume so much time and organization to create an event when we really have to focus on the learning. So that's kind of where I would go, Colin.
Thank you, John. And I think it's an important point. Your analogies you use are really helpful to think of things when it's not as personal to our work as teaching and leading of this work. And so it's a good segue too into Tom, who really has been instrumental in providing leadership, not only within Oak Ridge, but the MASA and around their instructional piece. And how do we ensure an equitable, not only access, but equitable opportunities for learning through high quality instruction. So whether it's through the curriculum, the instruction, the assessments we use, how do we ensure all students are able to advance in their learning, whether we're face-to-face in the hybrid or a remote setting. So with that, thank you, Tom, and Jason too. In a moment we'll be on, but Tom, if you can kind of talk us through from your lens as a superintendent, kind of how you came to this and how that actually helped you from your thinking to governance to communication in that.
Sure. Thank you, Colin. So a little bit of history, just a little bit about myself. I've been at Oak Ridge for 16 years, 4 as a curriculum director, assistant superintendent, and now almost 12 years as a superintendent. I've been in this seat, never having applied. I denied this opportunity 3 times before they talked me into taking it. And probably 1 year into the job, I had an 18-year-old run this senior campaign to get on the board and try to fire the superintendent. So 2 years, I had the staff came out to support me in that process and with a letter of support, and then the bottom dropped out of the economy, and 2 years later, there was no confidence vote in the superintendent. So things have gotten much better since the last recession, and I can say that board relations, union relations, staff relations are at all-time highs right now, believe it or not. And it's the whole analogy where you drop as many drops in the bucket as you can, because at some point you're going to have to pull some out and lead with some certainty and some strong, bold leadership. Back in March is when I had to pull some of those things out of that bucket, because there wasn't a lot of time for asking what people wanted to do. We had to be a little bit more directive in our approach to get ready for things to end the school year last year. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about our experience and getting ready for the new school year here and the process that we took. So I'm going to go through this presentation here, calling this is what our experience has been for the last few months. But I'll steal this quote from Albert Einstein: "Is the leader is one who out of all this clutter brings simplicity. Out of discord, I hope to bring harmony, and out of difficulty, we need to view this as an opportunity." And that's really the approach that I've been taking. I've been really blessed to be working with people like our high school principal, Jason McVoy, and I'm blessed to be able to have the quality experience that we have in relationship. So if I look like I know what I'm doing and I'm as calm as can be, like this duck in the water, just realize that beneath the water, there's a whole lot of paddling going on to try to get ready for the school year. So we're feverishly getting together and trying to put these plans together. So I'm going to go through a few things today, just kind of focusing with the process, structure, learning models that we put together, some of the challenges and barriers that we've been going through, as well as how we're trying to engage staff and community and the timeline that we're taking. So obviously, when all the information came out, we had to make sure everybody understood the My Safe Start map and the plans and what all the phases look like, because everybody wanted to know kind of what's the bearings and what's the framework that we're using. And so we really locked down to the My Safe Start map, like most school districts did. And then trying to put and frame everything into a timeline. So staff wanted to know, what are we going to do? And they were asking me that from day one. And so sometimes when leaders, you don't have a plan, you need to communicate that there's a plan to make a plan. And so that's what I was really trying to do when I put out a process in May of, because everybody asking, what are we going to do to get ready? Because everyone wanted to get ready for the new school year. Way back in June, I was trying to slow people down. It's like, hold up. There's MDE work groups. There's a governor's task force. GELN is getting together to put some of their plans, and all these things are happening at the same time. So let's just focus on making some quality, to the best of our ability, closure to the school year. And remember, this is the last year for some of these kids to have their experience with Oak Ridge teachers. So focus on your classroom now. Let's wait for some of these groups to get together and see what their plans are. And then we'll look at those My Start plans and develop our learning models in July and August. And that's what we're in the middle of right now. So this was what I released way back in May to kind of map out what the several months is going to look like, even though I wasn't real sure how that was going to go. But that was really helpful for people. Then I tried to provide a structure for everybody, knowing that all of those things were going on at the same time. And this thing has changed over the time. At one point, Muskegon County was going to have a group that got together and tried to build our plan. Once GELN got together, we decided to map our things to all the GELN work that was going on while the governor's task force was coming out with their roadmap, and the MDE task forces were coming out with some of their thoughts. And I was actually served on the MDE suburban group as well. So we quickly arranged our work to align with all of this so that there's continuity and alignment of efforts from the state down to the district level. And so how I organized it is, obviously the Board of Education is the ultimate decision maker for these things. I created a district governance team made up of all administrators, union leadership from all labor groups, and then some professionally certified staff and some pupil accounting experts. And we just divided these things up into the three categories, what I thought that the Opportunity Labs and the governor was going to come out with. And this has changed over the time. So we put those categories together, and each one of those, I put a task force chair to in charge of each of those areas with the responsibility for them to come back with plans for each of those areas. We talked about the phases and what type of learning would happen in each of those phases. And this was way back in May. This is very different now than what it was back then, which is what I'm showing you. And again, just trying to align it to that framework that we put together and just trying to give people a vision of what the work before us over June, July, and August would be. And so these were just visuals that we were putting together just to help people understand how this was all going to work. So how we're operating right now is our district governance team meets every single Thursday for an hour and a half. Next week, we're going to stretch that to 2 hours. And this group is what is making the decisions as being informed by all the task forces at the building and department levels throughout the district. So Jason, he's on the call today. He's going to talk about from middle school, high school perspective. He is in charge of the middle school, high school task force, which is baking into a lot of the focus on the instruction. Some of the our directors in the district, which we have a tech director, transportation director, food service and facilities. So I've got a person to dedicate to each one of those lanes, but obviously having to cooperate with each building principal. And so I have not had a single demand to bargain from the union. It has been 100% collaborative. There has been, it's been working really well. And I know it's not like that in every single district, but hopefully the things that we've done over the years to create this kind of environment for when things like happen, the collaboration is there. We hope that that's, we not hope, that is what's paying dividends right now. And that's kind of a look at the task force that I just, or excuse me, the governance team that I just mentioned. And I already mentioned all of the purpose of what that group has done is what I had already mentioned. So ultimately, we'll bring this to the board on Friday, August 14th, the day before it's due to the ISD. I will say some of the activities that our governance team went through as we really looked at our mission statement at the very beginning of this, since we went through a strategic planning process just a few short years ago, and really looking at the lens of what we need to be doing throughout this time. And so the words of partnership, pride, keeping our kids healthy, personalizing learning, those key words really were highlighted for us as we went to prepare for our learning plans each step of the way. We did all kinds of activities to get staff input using this tool called Menti.com and making sure that we knew what were the most important things and guiding principles that we would have as we prepared our back to school plan. We did some Padlet exercises to identify challenges and barriers that we needed to overcome. So we really had a good understanding at the beginning of this process and framing the work in each of the phases that we thought we were going to have to do at the time. So, and ultimately, we relied on our target goals for our strategic plan. Community engagement was a huge part of the process too. We've done multiple surveys. The last few weeks I've been doing Zoom webinars, very identical to what we're doing here. We're a 2,000 student district, so to have 250 parents show up to a webinar was amazing. Even through our bond project campaign, the highest number I think I ever had was 20. And so to have 250 parents show up tells you that there's a lot of engagement and interest in what our plans are as a district. And so this has been a main channel of communication to get information to our community so that they can make decisions that were best for them. So the last one I did was on Tuesday, and I spent 30 minutes in a Q&A session just continually answering questions. Of course, I run into people down at the ice cream shop and phone calls, graduation people come up to and talk to you. Parents are just craving to know, what are you doing? What are you doing? So constantly communicating and asking the questions and making sure our community is engaged as well. Staff engagement has been huge. These, with the positive relations, I daily, I'm talking to union presidents, bouncing off ideas, answering questions, doing surveys of each of them. They're very involved at the building level with the task force and bringing those decisions back to the governance team. So we have a high level of staff engagement in this process. And in fact, I hear from some of them, and because not every single district is operating this way, obviously. I've got teachers coming to me and saying, boy, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. I work in District X, and I haven't heard anything from my school district yet. And this was literally yesterday. And so we've been very fortunate to have the process that we have, and people are really feeling supported. So again, I laid out a plan way back in June. Every single week, we would tackle a different section of our back to school plan. And these were the topics that we covered for each of those dates. Now, these have changed over time, but at least I put a plan out there, and then we've adapted to it. So you can see every Thursday which sections of the governance, what sections of the back to school plan will be finalized and who needs to be responsible for bringing that back to the governance team. So that's a little bit about our process and what we went through to get here. So that might not be helpful with the date on the calendar that is today. How do you go and repeat that? But it kind of gives you a context that you can apply for what you're doing here in the future about some things that you may still be able to incorporate in your district in cooperation with your superintendents. But it is a team effort, and I'm thankful to have a principal like Jason where we're in lockstep every step of the way. So I'll let Jason go from there.
Before he does, I just want to say thank you, Tom, because whether it's this effort or any other initiative we undertake, I think you just laid out how quality leadership works with their team to do it, and how principals, whether you're the one in Jason's role where you're helping to help support the decision-making implementation, or if as a principal you're actually leading the effort to implement like you did, Tom, laying out and providing some road marks like that, I think are a really important step. And people appreciate that even if there's not an answer, that there's at least a plan in place, like you mentioned, and that the answers, or at least the decisions, will come and they know when those are coming, and that your ability to adapt and respond as the situation changes, rather than just waiting for somebody else to tell you what to do, or for some type of template that you could just jump in. I just think it speaks highly of who you are and the leadership and the collaboration that you guys have in your district. So with that, to my good friend Jason and an MASSP board member, obviously the principal there, we look forward to hearing from you from how now as a principal are we going to operationalize this in your role within this process and what we can take from that.
Thank you, Colin. Again, I'm Jason McFoy, principal at Oak Ridge High School and Middle School. And before I get into this, I just want to say to, what you and MASSP, Ryan, Wendy, and just the whole team there is doing for us right now is just absolutely an invaluable thing. And I know I'm speaking for all the principals on the call today. This is just an unbelievably challenging time, as everybody knows. But right now, as school leaders, we're being thrown right in the middle of a bullseye with every competing interest for our whole society and what's going to happen moving forward this year, because there's so many competing interests for all of us as parents, as teachers, as principals, superintendents. There's just so many things, and it's amazing to talk to all of you, and just when you put on different hats, how you might feel differently about the situation from one moment to the next, so it's just such a challenging time, but there is a lot of opportunity here for us to lead, which makes it very exciting too. So thanks again to all the work from MASSP. We really appreciate it. So yeah, I've just got 2 slides. I really wanted to just share kind of the more or less the nuts and bolts for some of our key considerations moving forward. Tom shared and put together an amazing plan for our district to look at it from the big picture, and that's what the superintendent obviously has to do. But it's so important for us as principals, I think, to be that key component within that team at the building level. And for me, it's been so important to have that communication back and forth. And he and I talk daily, and then also with other central office staff. And for many of you, you might have an assistant superintendent or instructional leader. And just to have that constant communication is so important right now, because obviously the plans we're creating, we can't do it in a silo. It's not going to be based on one building's plan. It's going to be based on a district overall plan, and we're one piece of that. So that's been absolutely the most important thing in all of this, because like I said, we all know we're weighing all these major considerations. Number one, we're all focused on safety for our students, for our staff, and the community at large, because we're talking about a virus that we're trying to help the big picture control this. So that's always in the back of our mind. How are we controlling this for the community? Because we know if we do something unsafe in one of our buildings, that's going to immediately ripple effect out and spread within our community and cause more chaos and just disruption. So with that, we're also looking very carefully at what is going to cause the least disruptions, the most continuity for our families, consistency, because we know kids need that consistency. They need our adult supervision. They need to come to school, but they also need consistently. And at some point, people really have got to be able to plan for what's coming. So we play a huge part in that. We all know our families need their kids to be in school. You know, most families need to get back to work, and they need that safe place for their kids to go. So that's weighing on all of us right now. And of course, our community demographics. And I think that's a big part of why we're seeing, as plans start to come out from different districts, they're looking very different. And none of them are right and none of them are wrong. There's just so many different aspects to this. So I'm going to pop into the next slide. If you just skip ahead to the next one there, Tom. I just want to say, this is where we started here at Oak Ridge. We looked at, after many meetings within our building level committees, and then also in our governance team, like Tom talked about, we had settled on this, and I felt like we were at a place where we really move forward and implement this. And I think many of you can sympathize with, as time's gone on, where I was at 6 weeks ago and back in mid-June is a very different place from where I'm at now, that we're at the end of July. And if you think back to mid-June, I know the governor's office at that time was saying, you know, the goal is, let's get to phase 5, hopefully by the 4th of July. And here we are at the end of July, and I think many people are very concerned we're going to start rolling backwards, possibly even going back to phase 3, maybe by the end of the month. And we're already seeing restrictions as came out yesterday. So the Upper Peninsula and Northern Michigan starting to get more restrictive and going back towards more where we're at. So things are shifting daily, but this is where we're at that time. We were looking at phase 1 through 3, of course, in remote learning. We were hoping to do a hybrid learning plan for phase 4 and phase 5 for K through 12. And then, of course, back to full in-person instruction for phase 6. Tom, if you just jump to the next slide there. So through much consideration, and also now starting to look at some districts, especially in other states, that have started to open in a very similar model to that, we had a cohort plan with two days of in-person instruction, 3 days of remote. But what we're seeing is more and more risk there. We've also learned so much, as I know everybody's learning about the safety protocols that are going to be required to go through as we come back and as students present symptoms and staff present symptoms. And one of the major concerns with those safety protocols, we were really feeling like it was going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to implement for us, is the protocol of when a student or a staff member presents symptoms, that person, anyone in their immediate contact, would have to be quarantined for either 10 to 14 days. And looking at that on a school-wide perspective, thinking about the amount of disruption that's going to cause, and the reality of being able to get subs for that many teachers, when you're talking 6 teachers potentially, if we were to run the schedule we were planning, we got to a point we just started seeing the negatives starting to outweigh the positives of getting the kids back in the building for 2 days. So where we're moving to now, this is of course not final, and it hasn't actually been released publicly yet outside of our district. So just asking everybody that may have any contact with our district to keep that in mind. We're working on this. Tom is looking to take this public next week as we continue to finalize things, but we're looking to just shift that one phase up for our secondary only, for our middle school and high school, to not come back into that hybrid model until phase 5, when we feel things are going to be much more safe, and we'll be able to have that model in place and be somewhat consistent, not have the massive disruptions we're starting to foresee would happen in phase 4. We are looking to continue with that hybrid model for our kindergarten through 6th grade, because we've got a lower L and an upper L up through 6th grade. Our middle school starts in 7th grade. And then in phase 5, bring the hybrid model in for secondary as well. And of course, phase 6, we hope we can be there soon. We'll all be back to normal and rolling on with things. But that is how things have shifted just for us, literally in the past few days, as we've been looking at things more and more in depth and what types of major concerns we have for our students and for staff as well. And I should bring that up, is that we've got many staff members at the secondary in particular that feel that they couldn't see a safe path to do this as well. And we need to start really focusing on, like John said earlier, we need to focus on getting our teachers prepared for online learning. And no matter what your model looks like moving ahead, all of us need to focus on that, because we know there's a strong likelihood in some way that's going to be what they're doing this fall. Whether it's through a hybrid model or fully in person, or if we do have to revert back to phase 3, our staff's going to be doing a lot of online learning, and we're teaching and learning, and we've got to get them moving and prepared for that. So the professional development needs to roll out in the next month. It's going to be tremendous. I think that's all I've got with those. I'm more than happy to take any questions, and I know anybody else in the panel here would be more than happy to do that. So for it.
Hybrid approach that you're just talking about, and pushing that to phase 5. So essentially 7-12, because of the safety precautions, wearing masks, all the other things that go with that, and your teachers and your students, right? So it mentioned that you're going to have in-person consultation available by appointment. So are you anticipating that K-12 staff would report every day, and then those teachers during essentially working or instructional hours would be available to your students by appointment? Or are you anticipating they would be remote, coming in occasionally or something? What's your current thinking around that?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Colin. I meant to mention that. So yeah, our current thinking is that for secondary, if we're in phase 4, secondary would be the remote. But the difference in phase 4 is that we are allowed to have students come into the building. Unlike back in the spring in phase 3, we couldn't do that. So that is one of the exciting things about this, is that our staff, we would require them to come in during regular school hours. And right now our planning is that they would be engaged in teaching during the morning hours. The afternoon, they'd completely just be available for our students with open office hours by appointment. So kids could schedule that. We're looking at options for somehow to provide some transportation, because we want to get rid of the major equity issue we know that's going to be in place there, with some kids having access with transportation, some are not. So we're trying to figure out how to overcome that part. But we definitely want to make sure our teachers are in the classroom available and teaching from the classroom in the mornings, providing either asynchronous and synchronous types of lessons in the morning. But one of the key aspects I've told our staff is that if they are trying to do a live lesson, which is great, and we're going to have scheduled times for that, it can't be a mandate or requirement to be involved in that live lesson for us, because I think that's another major equity issue. We don't know what's going to be going on in those kids' homes. We want to make sure they've got access to it, so they'll have to post that recorded live lessons for kids to access the time that they can. And the lessons will be due on a weekly basis. The assignments would be due on a weekly basis and not due on a particular day, just because there is such a lack of control of what's going on in homes and access on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, the other benefit for that, just for those in the audience, is that from a pupil accounting manual point of view, when you have a cyber school or a virtual school of that sort, one of the things is you don't have to demonstrate 1,098 hours, 180 days of instruction per course or by that, but the district needs to be able to provide some type of documentation of their 180 days currently and 1,098 hours. And so that 1,098 hours doesn't have to be face-to-face instructional time. It can include any time that a teacher is available, whether they're planning, communicating, interacting, providing live or asynchronous learning. So by doing that and having your teachers available during the day, even though the students aren't there in your 7-12, that then is countable hours, if you will, that you can use as part of pupil accounting. So that's a benefit of having your teachers on staff, is you can just essentially share your building calendar and teaching agreement piece, and it will show those hours are there. So that's a benefit of with your approach. The other thing that you brought up was in that model is around the SXI, so for your severely multiply impaired students. So I think you regionally pull those kids in.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about your thinking around special education and providing those services to those students.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we do have an SXI regional-based program, which is housed in our middle school. And they're working on a plan actually to bring those students in every single day as their goal, because we know the major needs that they have, and many of them are physical needs that they really need to be there. So we think, based on our student count, that we'll be under 10, so we can meet that expectation and have them socially distanced in the classroom. So that's what we're working on currently. There may be a possibility we have to shift it to a hybrid model depending on the numbers. With the remainder of our, most of our special ed students who are LD students, EI students, what we're looking to do is create a regular scheduled resource hour every single day to try and get those students into, or at least make it available and let the families know our special ed team is available and expecting them, if at all possible, for them to get here, to give them the extra support we know they're going to need. So that is a major concern of our special ed team, and we're trying to create a plan where we get to see them, if not at least daily, we're going to see them at least weekly to keep checking in on them and helping them through the process of online learning.
The wisdom in that, beyond just the equity that you mentioned in that, from a compliance point of view, I know many of us in the spring were really worried about compensatory education and IDEA. And by doing that, you can demonstrate that you've taken those things into consideration and continue to provide services to those students and families within your communities. Have you thought about or had much conversation around how you might be able to use some of those times with the appointments, or even like you're saying, those resource hours from an RTI point of view? So being able to provide intervention for students who may or may not have IEPs to help to accelerate or close achievement gaps from the spring through this pandemic?
Yeah, we have. And, our teachers are really strong on that. They said one of the beauties of this model is that, and this is what helped push us in this direction, is that we can focus our efforts on our kids we see as they start to struggle, and we can reach out to them and encourage them and find a way to get them into the building, to give them the face-to-face attention, either individually or in small groups as needed, based on content area where they're struggling. So it can be very targeted, and we can work directly with the kids that really need the most help. The majority of our kids will do fine, and they'll keep moving along, and they'll be okay. And we had good results in the spring, but we also know that expectations are going to be tougher, and they're going to be more challenging, more rigorous coming this fall. It's going to be much more like regular school. It's just going to be virtual. So they're going to need more support, and we're going to really focus and keep an eye on those grades as they start coming in, and try and focus our efforts on getting face-to-face with those kids that need the help.
So Colin, here might be a good time to interject and why it's essential to have incredible relationships between central office and building principals is, as Jason is clearly articulating a vision for what we need to do at the building level. As I've been going through these community forums and community engagement, talking with the community, trying to sell this hybrid plan, I've got both school board members and a lot of people in the community who are pressuring me to have more in-person instruction. At the same time, we're having conversations with staff to having less in-person instruction. And so having these open dialogues between Jason and I, and I've obviously allowed the conversation to be opened and encouraged them to have these dialogues. I think that's the direction we're probably going to go. But now I got to go back to the community and say, okay, I know I told you this last week, and you really appreciate the comments that I would get. It's like, boy, at least I get 2 days a week in person. Well, now I'm taking the 2 days a week away to a school board member that said, my kid was not successful at all with the remote learning last March, and now you're not going to even do the 2 days. So that's the push and pull that we're having right now, and I'm very confident we'll work through that. Jason and I work really well together through these things, but he knows the pressures and understands the context that I'm coming from, and he keeps me informed of what his context is with his staff, and that's how you meet the sometimes conflicting needs collaboratively.
I think an important piece that you just mentioned is within that collaboration isn't just that you and Jason are talking on the same page, but how the language you use and how you message it needs to be consistent, right? Because some people say virtual learning, some say remote. What does that mean? Is it packets or is it this? And, I've read some articles and people have been really trying to distinguish between pandemic learning, which is what we did in the spring, which was more crisis response, and remote learning or virtual learning now in the fall. And so how do we help to educate our communities, particularly our parents, our board members, our teachers, around what this learning is going to look like, so it's not supplemental or fill in a gap, but really is advancing learning. And I think that's an important piece in how we use language to communicate. So we, because I think a lot of it too is they're worried about having what they had in the fall or in the spring, where maybe there wasn't feedback, there wasn't new learning, there wasn't a lot of accountability, there wasn't maybe as much support. And what's that going to look like now as we go forward? into that piece. So thank you for echoing that and really reinforcing how important that is for central office and building level administrators to be together with their teachers and their families in that, because that's so critical. A couple questions that are coming up. I know, John, you've addressed some of them already. For Chris, you're bringing up the piece around, can you share a link or more specific on the pupil accounting? So we will send out a link to, we have an FAQ from our pupil accounting manual, and we've added in some pieces to that as well. So we have a published FAQ, so we will include that in our distribution for that. That comes from the pupil accounting manual itself, or additions from the pupil accounting manual itself. But essentially, there are some specific things you have to do, whether it's independent study, whether it's a virtual class, whether it's a cyber school, like all those things have little nuances, whether or not you have to have daily attendance or two-way communication and that type of thing. So we will send that to you with this. And it's also posted in our Reopen the Schools toolkit that we have. The second question is from Aaron, and it's specific to how does the governor's new requirements that indoor groups be less than 10 people impact the plan schools are putting in place for in-person instruction and before and after school activities? So there's a couple things, nuances to keep in mind. When you think about instruction is not the same as a social gathering or an event. So as far as returning to school, so whether you do that face-to-face hybrid or you do some type of remote, know that that's based on your return to school preparedness plan and what's outlined as required, strongly recommended, and recommended in the roadmap to reopening school. So that's one factor there. The other part then is when it comes to social gatherings and events. So when it comes to maybe an open house social gathering, if it comes to, like, some schools or at least communities have offered a prom social gathering, graduation parties, social gatherings, graduation, social event, a football game, an event, a volleyball game, an event. So if there are things like that, they're limited, which is why even in the MHSA proposal, they haven't released start dates for things, because you're limited to those 10 people when you're inside and 100 people when you're outside, unless you're in region 6 or 8, where it's up to, I think, 250. But I got to double check that. So with that said, the questions that have been coming up more recently is, what about marching band camp? So, for example, my son, who's a marching band person, he is providing instruction. They have 185 kids in their band, so they've split into 2 groups. So they only have half their band report at any given time. So they're splitting what they used to do during a day into 2 chunks. So only 90 of the kids or 80 of the kids are showing up at one time with the staff that's there, because that would be an event. Some people would say that's a school piece, so it fits under that because it's co-curricular. Troon Law put out some guidance that said, no, that's an event. So I would seek your legal counsel on what constitutes an event or a social gathering and the limits that apply to you. But in general, they're the extracurriculars and the other associated community engagement things that you're doing that fit with that, that we should be mindful of. In our response plan that we'll be sending to you as well, there's some other frequently asked questions. So the department is requiring that people are going to be submitting the response plans after they are approved by their board to the government for their review. Although the EO doesn't require any approval, they're just collecting those. The second piece is that the governor did put out recently a frequently asked questions, and it's not very long, but it does say some specific pieces that I think are important. In particular, that caught my attention had to do with facial coverings. And so I'll just leave this here a moment for people to take a look at. We'll include this as well. But what is a facial covering? What is not? What's an acceptable alternative? And I thought that was pretty crystal clear. Face masks are face masks, not shields. And so who can? The other thing, and I think this is important, Jason brought up how they have an early elementary, a later elementary, and then a middle school, high school. But their middle school is 7th through 12th grade. And so one of the things it talked about was the cohorting of students. And so when you think about cohorting of students, it only applies to students in grades K through 5 or pre-K through 5. If you're in 6 and higher embedded in that, those 6th graders don't count. So even if you go to cohort your 6th graders, your 8th graders, your 12th graders, trying to get away from the masking, it doesn't apply. You still have to wear the mask. The only exception for the cohorting is specific to the elementary. So this just came out. I don't know if it was Monday, but it was very recently. It just came out. Might have been
The
Tuesday.
FAQ?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And so we will include this in our distribution. It will also go on our roadmap. But I thought this was, whether you like it or not, at least you're not guessing anymore. And so I think that's an important piece from that. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us today and being part of our Leader to Leader. Did you, John, you want to add something?
I just want to mention one thing, because Jason brought up a great point. The professional learning that's needed, is like it's never been before. So GLN's next step, the task force, is to catalog ISD services from around the state into one place, and our commitment is asynchronous and free. And so, I would encourage you to reach out, to your ISDs. GLN is actually meeting right now. So I'm here and they're meeting there to talk about this. And so things around, how to conduct or create good virtual lessons, how to build relationships virtually, a lot of those things are there. We realize that, not all regions are created equally. And so, but how can we create better equity by sharing those resources that, that are being developed, across the state. So, and I know MASSP is huge on the professional learning too, but just wanted to put that out there that there should be or will be resources to help.
Yes, thank you, John. In closing, thank you, Tom and Jason and John, for being a part of this, for taking the time to prepare, to share, and to celebrate the things that you have done, and support those around the state that can learn from you. People in their introduction said they're hoping for ideas and some direction and even just a framework, and I believe you provided that for us. So for those interested, next week on August 6th from 9 to 11:30, we will be having a paid webinar. It's our only one that's a cost fee because we're bringing in a national speaker to talk about closing the pandemic-related achievement gap. So we encourage you to join us by going to massp.com/events, noting that we will continue to have free Leader to Leaders. This is the only one we're doing next week, but then we'll have some other Leader to Leaders starting up after that, including one with the College Board about some new flexibilities. If you haven't read already, the assessment spotlight, there is some flexibility that will be available for this fall as far as dates that you administer PSAT and SAT, as well as the start times. So not everybody has to start and end at the same time, and nobody has to administer on the same dates. So we will have a webinar, I believe it's going to be on August 13th, specific to that and the flexibilities that come with that. Not that that's your immediate need, but I know that's been something that's been on our members' minds as we go forward. So thank you for joining us today. We wish you well this afternoon and into the coming weekend. Much deserved. So thank you all and have a great afternoon.